Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Finding the Source. I am Ashley Lusky. I'm the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, and I am flying solo for this evening's program. My usual partner in crime, Pete Carmichael, has left me to the four winds to go do apparently bigger and better things this week. So I am the only host this week. Usually he and I co-host, as some of you know who have been a part of this program before. But I am in good company today with our guest, who is Professor Sarah Handley-Cousins. She is a clinical assistant professor of history and the associate director of the Center for Disability Studies of the University at Buffalo. And Sarah, that's where you got your graduate degree, correct?
It is, yes.
Yes. So you returned home to your alma mater.
I did. I did not travel far.
That's right. Sarah is also a prolific writer, a prolific public scholar. In her dual roles there, she is the author of numerous scholarly articles, as well as several pieces for the New York Times series Disunion, which some of you may be familiar with, which ran during the Civil War sesquicentennial. She is also the editor of a popular blog called Nursing Cleo, which at the end of the interview, Sarah, I hope you can maybe talk a little bit about Nursing Cleo and your role there, as well as the producer of a podcast called Dig, which is labeled Dig, a History Podcast. So hopefully we can also talk a bit about that, your role as a public-facing scholar. She and I also have something in common, unique in common, in that we are graduates of the Gettysburg semester, which unfortunately is no longer running.
I know, that makes me so sad.
It was a great program.
It
was kind of a domestic study away program for undergraduate students who could come to Gettysburg College for a semester and immerse themselves in Civil War era studies classes, battlefield experiences, internships. And Sarah, remind me what year you did the Gettysburg semester.
I was fall of 2005.
Okay, so you were the year before me.
Yes.
I was fall of 2006. Yes, wonderful experience. So
oh my gosh,
Sarah
totally.
Has the Gettysburg connection in more ways than one, which we'll talk about today with her research as well. But during a recent social media interaction, perhaps the most important thing that Sarah took away from the Gettysburg semester is that she and I both learned from that semester that battlefield is not just a noun. It can actually be a verb as well. So no need to say when going to explore a battlefield, I'm going to go walk the battlefield. You just need to say, I'm going to go battlefielding.
Yes, I am battlefielding.
I didn't quite realize that that was something that was more unique to the Gettysburg semester. Maybe
I think it is.
But yeah, that's when I started using the noun as a verb. So another takeaway from today's program is that you can just say, I'm going battlefielding when you're exploring a Civil War battlefield.
There you go.
In the future. But today we are going to talk about Sarah's most recent book, published in 2019, Bodies in Blue, Disability in the Civil War North, which gives a fascinating look into not only the different types of disabilities that Civil War soldiers and veterans confronted with, but also how this affected the way that they tried to reintegrate back into society, affected cultural beliefs about disability, about manhood, about duty and honor, and so forth. So it's really a fascinating study on multiple layers. And I think, Sarah, to get us started, I'd like you to kind of talk about the wide scope of disabilities that Civil War soldiers had to confront with. Obviously, we know, as you say in your book, that the Civil War wreaked havoc on Civil War soldiers' bodies. Anyone who has any familiarity with Civil War scholarship, who has been to a battlefield before, has of course seen the graphic images of bloated bodies lying on battlefields, of amputees, of men hobbling around on prosthetics, which of course is the most popular image. But as you also note in your book, amputees made up a small fraction of soldiers who dealt with disability. So what were some of the other types of disabilities, and how could they impact the bodies of soldiers?
Yeah. When I started the project, I actually started it specifically because I was interested in amputation. That was the subject that my dissertation advisor suggested for me, because I was thinking about what can I do that would be sort of reflect my interest in medicine and also reflect sort of my interest in, like, I don't know, the gorier aspects of history. And I think that that's a common experience that people have when they think about disability in the Civil War. Is our minds immediately go to amputation and amputees, and that's because amputees are so sort of ubiquitous in the imagery of the Civil War, right? We've all seen them. And then, even in even more graphic terms, if you visit, like you mentioned, any battlefield, but I remember, particularly when I was studying in Gettysburg, the standing in, I couldn't tell you the name of the house now, but in one of the houses that on the backside of Little Round Top that was used as a field hospital, and talking about the pile of limbs growing, outside the window as they tossed those limbs out. And so amputation is what we always associate with the war. And there's good reason for that, right? I mean, it was very obvious. It is accompanied by very graphic imagery. But pretty quickly when I was researching, I started to come across all of these other ways that soldiers were being physically impacted by the war. And of course, there's the sort of the battlefield damage, right? The war wounds. So soldiers are, injured in any way that you can imagine. Shrapnel, they have, limbs taken off by balls. I was just reading something about a young man who's 20 years old, has his leg taken basically clean off by a 6-pound solid shot at Philippi. And so there's that sort of war wound damage, right? One of the soldiers that I study a lot was shot straight through the body. That wound remained open for the rest of his life. And so that's disabling in that it's, a source of continuous infection, continuous pain. Of course, Joshua Chamberlain is shot through the body sort of crosswise. And that is a source of continuous pain and continuous infection. But then expanding even beyond that, I thought it was also important to think about the ways that war was disabling without someone actually being shot, right? Or injured in combat. Because the diseases that we're so familiar with, I mean, we know that soldiers dealt with dysentery and typhus and typhoid and malaria and yellow fever. I mean, you name it, right? We know that those things happen, but we often don't think about the long-term effects that those ailments had. So, take malaria just as one example. In the 19th century, that was called intermittent fever, because you would have this kind of relapsing experience where you'd get better and you could be better for a long time. And then you could have this like sudden relapse with where you become terribly, terribly sick. And that happened to soldiers sometimes for the rest of their lives, where they dealt with sort of those relapses of malaria. Dysentery often led to chronic diarrhea that soldiers are, petitioning the Pension Bureau about 20, 30, 40 years after the war. So I tried to really, what I really wanted to do was kind of get the breadth of experience, sure, rather than just focusing on one particular kind of disability.
Sure. And what you talk about with the recurring disabilities, 19th century notions of disability, did people have to be continuously and permanently disabled in order to be regarded as disabled in 19th century society? Or could those things that come and go qualify in most people's minds as, oh, you have a disability, even though sometimes you appear fine?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I really think that this is a question that is so relevant to today as well. I mean, this is something that people grapple with even now. We've all had the experience of, watching someone park and put up their handicap tag and somebody saying like, well, they can walk. Like, why do they get to park there and I don't, right? Because disability often looks a lot different than we expect it to. We expect it to look like someone who is either very obviously visually, a disability that's visually apparent, something like an amputation, or that someone is so profoundly unable to lead a typical life that we recognize it right away, right? And so those soldiers that had those, particularly soldiers that were disabled by chronic disease, really struggled to prove to people that they really were as disabled as they said, especially when, as you said, it kind of ebbed throughout their life, right? There was not a good understanding that even wounds that healed, like say for instance, someone who was shot through the body or was shot and didn't have an amputation, there wasn't a good understanding that those wounds, even when they healed, could still continue to bother someone, right? They could still cause pain, they could still cause changes in mobility, and that over time they could degrade further, right? That they would continue to get sort of worse and impact someone's health throughout the course of their life. And so when a soldier appeared like he was able to function in a typical way, people were not particularly willing to see that person as disabled.
Right.
And the place that we see this come up the most is when they apply for pensions, right? I mean, the public, certainly there are some things written about, in newspapers and in magazines like Harper's or whatever, where there are people trying to like out fake disabled veterans, but really where a lot of that sort of critique of disability comes from is in the pension records, where soldiers are trying to convince the Pension Bureau that yes, their chronic diarrhea, it gets really bad, at particular times, but then other times I can work.
Right.
But it's during those times that I'm really sick that I can't, and I need that support. And the Pension Bureau really was not set up for that. They really wanted to see you prove that you could not function in order to give you those payouts.
Sure. And of course and we're going to delve into this more in a few minutes, that has to do with so many things, pragmatic reasons, as well as cultural beliefs about dependency. And the pension files are just so fascinating for people who are looking to get their hands dirty and some really
absolutely
interesting primary sources. If you have access to Fold 3 and you can get on and look at some of these pensions, soldiers' pensions, or even widows' pensions, have some really, really unique perspectives on some of these lingering wounds that soldiers had to deal with. It's just fascinating.
I think one of the at least the last time I was looking on Fold 3, I know that they were in the process of digitizing lots of widows records.
Yes.
And particularly like USCT widows records. And like, gosh, what a great project that would be.
That is a new thing. It's a rich mine of information that, if you can read 19th century handwriting, it's open to everyone if you can get onto Fold 3. So before we delve into the pensions, can we go back to what were some of the pragmatic issues plaguing society with having so many disabled or supposedly disabled men out there, both during the war years themselves and afterwards?
So one of the immediate concerns is really getting soldiers back to a place of productivity. I mean, one of the pragmatic concerns, I should say, before I even talk about sort of getting them back to work, is manpower, right? During the war itself. I mean, there are constant concerns about keeping the fighting force as powerful as possible. And, sometimes we can fall into this trap of thinking that like, well, the Union Army was so much bigger than the Confederate Army. And so manpower was never a problem for them. And that's really not true.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider the massive support networks, right? The massive amount of people that they needed to do things like run ambulances and, you know, carry supplies and man prison camps and like all of that.
Yeah, all the logistics. Yeah.
Yeah, you need bodies to do that.
Sure.
And so one of the sort of immediate concerns is trying to figure out ways that the Army could keep as many men close to the battlefield and able to continue serving in some capacity, even though they were disabled. And so that's in 1863, the solution that they propose is to create the Invalid Corps, which later is called the Veterans Reserve Corps. And this is a way of, instead of discharging soldiers that were less profoundly disabled or less profoundly sick, they would be transferred into the Invalid Corps, and then they could be used for in those support capacities, right? Often as prison guards and things like that. One or two Invalid Corps troops is sent to New York, for instance, during the draft riots. Right. So they're a way of having reserves that can do those things that you need bodies for, even if they can't keep up on the march, they can't maybe fight or drill the way that they might have been able to before. So that's one immediate sort of pragmatic concern. Right.
Which also it works for the soldiers as well, who keep getting paid their soldiers' wage, and they have an identity as a soldier.
Yeah.
But as you point out in your book, it also segregates them as different and named and not like other soldiers, which of course gets back to these ideas of manhood that we'll delve into in just a bit.
Yeah, they were not universally thrilled about being put. I mean, especially when you think about the fact that at the beginning of the experiment, it's called the Invalid Corps, right? And that is not exactly what these guys wanted to be known as. And there's a whole bunch of other ways that they feel sort of marginalized. They're given different colored uniforms. They absolutely hate that. And, you know, I found it really striking how many of those men, like, I think we would think that they would be relieved to be able to stay, you know, for reasons associated with masculinity, certainly. But I found more often that they were really frustrated and they would have rather been discharged, not because they felt like they physically couldn't handle it, but because if they were going to serve, they wanted to be with their comrades. They wanted to be with their units that they had that were battle tested and that they had, you know, established bonds with. And if they weren't going to fight with them, they really didn't want to stay, right? But nevertheless, I mean, it does become an important organization. It actually outlives the Civil War, continues to operate, I think, almost into the 1870s. I don't know the exact date, but it continues to serve in that support capacity. So that's one sort of pragmatic concern. And then there's, you know, sort of the more existential pragmatic concern, which is, what are we going to do with all of these disabled people? Like it becomes very clear, like right away, like first Manassas, right, that this war is going to create a lot of men who are going to be disabled for life and who are not going to be able to work in the ways that they had been able to work before. They're going to need a variety of different kind of supports, you know, everything from prosthetic limbs to, you know, support because they can't work, right? And so that's why in 1862, the first pension bill is passed. But even then, one of the ideas behind the Invalid Corps was, if we can keep men in the ranks, we can pay them while still extracting labor from them.
Right.
If we discharge them and they use that pension, once that's passed in 1862, we're paying them, but we're not getting anything for it. So that was sort of an incentive to keep as many men as possible in that invalid corps.
Right. Right. And I think for a lot of us, when we hear about these massive battles, Antietam, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, and we hear about so many men being wounded, and we think, well, they're out for good,
Right.
they're done with their service.
Yeah.
And then when you process those numbers, the math doesn't add up, that if they really lost that many men from the service at every battle, there wouldn't have been any men left. So a lot of those men do go back in, whether it's the invalid corps or just going back into the regular unit after they've recovered, which is remarkable, that they can go back and rejoin their comrades.
Yeah, and this was something that I almost felt silly, or like I had missed something when I was researching the first couple of chapters of the book. I was like, wait, I thought that once you got wounded, you just went home. I thought that's, and honest to God, what I was basing that on was Forrest Gump. I mean, that was like my understanding of how this worked, right? You got your shot in the buttocks and then that was it. We went home. And that is not how things operated during the Civil War. First, at the beginning of the war, they don't actually have a standardized plan for who gets discharged and for what. And so there are debates about that, right? When is it appropriate to discharge someone and when can you bring them back? And so that was one of the things that I found really interesting in researching was, as you mentioned, learning more about those guys who were either disabled and still in the ranks, not in the invalid corps, but still in the ranks, or men who were suffering with, various ailments and trying to keep up, trying to continue to fight and march and live in camp and deal with the climate and all those things, while being really sick and not able to get discharged, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think about too, in terms of other pragmatic reasons that the federal government had to deal with in the midst of a war, that they're trying to keep men on the ground, they're trying to keep the war going, they're trying to strategize. It's enormously costly. And so to think about having to then fund all these people, as you said, who you're paying out money and they're not getting any labor out of them, there's a pragmatic issue with that too. But also the enormous amount of bureaucratic paperwork that goes into the system with these pensions. And that's one of the most, I think, eye-opening things for me when I first looked at widows' pensions and soldiers' pensions online, was looking at how many pages some of these things could be to get testimony and surgeons to sign off on the disability being permanent, and statements of good character and marriage records and all of that that goes into it. And when you're messing already with so much paperwork of how to keep the war going, and then you have to turn to, okay, how are we going to process these thousands and thousands of pensions that are coming in, is a real pragmatic concern. And of course, issues of concerns of fraud and people who are faking it, and all of that. So, I think as we kind of merge into our discussion about the more cultural aspects of disability and kind of suspicions of disability, I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind that there were some real pragmatic issues here with determining disability and actually paying out for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in the book, I can be pretty critical of people in positions of authority, for not maybe taking soldiers seriously all the time. But it is important to remember that they had a vested interest in winning this war.
Right.
And so they, the Union Army officials who are deciding who gets discharged and where they get sent, all of that was kind of fraught, right? Because they really did need to keep manpower up. And so it can look very nefarious. It can look like discrimination. It can look like, them just being cruel and not wanting, soldiers to go home or whatever it is, debates over furloughs and all of that kind of thing. But I mean, they really did have great concern over losing too many men through discharge, or being generous with furloughs and keeping your morale high, but then some portion of those furloughed soldiers are not going to come back, right? And so those are all, as you mentioned, pragmatic concerns that the Army has to deal with.
Sure. For sure. So let's turn to this idea of manhood and masculinity in the 19th century. And you're unpacking these various different notions of masculinity: restrained masculinity versus martial masculinity, and then kind of how those two combine and morph into what you call, what is it, the true union?
The true soldier of the Union, I think.
Soldier of the Union, yes. So can you kind of unpack for everyone watching, how does that transformation occur, and what are the new expectations for the true soldier of the Union? And I love how you use the term, by the way, that the war was a crucible of manhood, because that does imply all of these negotiations about previous conceptions of manhood, as well as the realities of what the war does to men's bodies and notions of manhood. So can you kind of walk us through those three different ideas of masculinity first, and set us up for what are people expecting the true soldier of the Union to look like?
There is so much written about, so many wonderful books written about masculinity in the war itself and in the lead up to the war. And so I really had to kind of think very critically about what I was seeing and how that related to those notions of, which I think were first coined by Amy Greenberg, of restrained masculinity and martial masculinity. And restrained masculinity is really sort of the dominant middle class notion of masculinity that exists in the North before the Civil War. And this is, very genteel. These are men who are able to control their passions, right? They need to be sort of good Christians and be temperate and not be drinkers and just it's very much about control, right? And then on the other hand, you have this more physical masculinity, or as is sometimes called martial masculinity, which is associated much more with the working class in the North. And this is more where men sort of pride themselves on their physicality, on their ability to drink, and hold their liquor. And of course, as many people know, there's all of these conflicts about, alcohol consumption between officers and soldiers. I mean, and this is one of those places that you see where those conflicts between officers and enlisted men come up, right? Because they have these very differing ideas of what it means to be a man, and officers are expecting soldiers to behave in this controlled, genteel way. Sure. And often those enlisted men are, not interested in that. That is not what they think is manly.
That's such a great point, because you had brought up, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just real quick, one of the things that you bring up is that there were differences. We can't say that there was a monolithic ideal of masculinity. Right. And that's one thing I always caution students against, as well as the monolithic community, whether it's the Black community, whether it's the Irish community. Right. It's the same thing here. Ethnic differences, racial differences, class differences, regional differences for sure. And account for different ideas of masculinity. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's an important point to remember.
Yeah, and I mean, even you mentioned regional differences, the differences even in the kind of work that men did, right? Like they might share the general desire to be independent, for instance, right? Or self-sufficient. But that might mean something very different for someone who's a laborer in New York City, a dock worker in Buffalo, versus, a farm worker from Wisconsin. Their ideas of what it means to be independent and self-sufficient are going to look sort of different. So this is, in many ways kind of painting with a broad brush,
Sure.
to describe these groups, but these are the general sort of categories that men fall into. And so what I found is that through the war, men have to sort of consolidate those ideas, because those restrained genteel men are still going to have to take up arms and fight and kill and be physical and brutal in ways that don't fit into that genteel, proper middle class manhood. And the martial men, the men in the ranks, or the men who have that, more sort of rough around the edges masculinity, have to adhere to military discipline. And so through that process, something else is sort of developed. And not all men appreciated that, especially, sometimes the soldiers didn't appreciate being, having to adapt to military discipline. And that's often something that, is a conflict between enlisted men and officers. But in the long run, what I sort of, when I talk about this idea of the true soldier of union, is that had less to do with the soldiers themselves and more to do with civilians. Mm-hmm. And so civilians, especially after the war, start to separate out different categories of veterans. They start to sort of try to make sense of this huge number of veterans that now live in, Northern society, by categorizing them. And they come up with this thing that I call the true soldier of union, which is this sort of fictional idea of a soldier who did his duty, fought valiantly, never asked for anything in return, fought without complaint, would never dream of shirking or straggling or spending too long in the hospital, and certainly didn't have an expectation that he would be repaid for any of those things, and certainly not for the rest of his life. Right. So ideally, there were some, especially I'd say Democrats in the North, who believed that a real true soldier of union would not accept $1 from the government. Right. Because you did it out of your civic duty, right? It was your duty as an American. Right. And so they come up with different categories to put the men that don't fit into that, right? There are malingerers, there are mercenaries, bounty jumpers, right? All these different categories of people that weren't in it for the right reasons. And those are the bad ones. Because it's really difficult after the war to criticize veterans, right? They're the victors of the Union. You can't call them out. You can't criticize them. But by labeling them as kind of the bad ones, these are the bad ones over here, we can criticize them. We're not criticizing the good guys, right?
Right. And that's, of course, where the complexities of those pension files come into play, because ideally, yes, it would be great to have this wide slew of soldiers who didn't take $1 from the government and were just so virtuous, and were so stoic that they never complained or whined too much about their suffering.
Right.
But the reality is, of course, you have a war that leaves hundreds of thousands dead, and then you have thousands and thousands wounded, that they have to accept money in some form. And of course, 19th century notions, fears of pauperism, which you bring up in your book, and fears of dependency on the government for the rest of your life. If you take that paycheck once, then you'll never want to work again. That complicates all of that, because they have these fears about who these veterans could turn out to be. But then there's the reality of the fact that these guys need that support, and they're not able to produce in the same way that they had before the war. And one of the things that you stress in your book, which is so good, is how those expectations, those conflicting expectations of veterans, that has a wide impact on society too, on marriages, on protecting children, on providing for children, family relationships that break down, these men feeling so emasculated by the fact that they can't work a job themselves that would provide for their wives and for their children, and how emasculating that is, to have to rely on the federal government.
Yeah.
Which is it reveals the contradictions, and kind of an ideal that could never play out to reality in the
Exactly.
wake of the war.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I found so striking, sort of one of those things that you find in your research that kind of stops you in your tracks, is a handful of newspaper articles about how really the best veterans are Confederate veterans. And this is like in northern newspapers, because they're saying they didn't have anything. They don't have any government handouts.
Yeah.
And yet it's our soldiers are living off of the government dime, proving that they're not really true citizen soldiers. They're not ideal men. They're willing to get these handouts. Look at the Confederate soldiers who are, just kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and they're doing everything themselves, and they're rebuilding their society. And I was like, that is so wild, right? That is so wild to say, like, okay, like, we won this war. These guys were our enemies, but actually they are better men than our soldiers are, who just won this war, right? It shows you how important, or the importance that was placed on ideas of masculinity.
Sure. Yeah, ideas of masculinity, and also just that fear of dependence.
Exactly.
Fear of dependence, permanent dependence on the federal government.
Yeah.
So as a follow-up to that, when these soldiers did come home and apply for these pensions, can you kind of unpack for us some of I mentioned a few of the items that would go into these pension files, some of the ways that they were trying to accommodate those two contested notions of masculinity, the stoic, patriotic soldier who willingly sacrificed for the cause of union, and then performing the proper role of the wounded warrior. And there's so much performance that goes into this, and you have to walk this fine line. So how did they seek to do that in those pension files to accommodate those two extreme expectations?
Yeah, I love that you use the word performance, because it really is, they essentially, what develops over time is essentially a script that soldiers end up kind of falling into. And one thing that I don't know, that I wasn't able to really get at, is how that narrative, how that script developed. Part of me thinks it has probably something to do with the influence of pension attorneys at some point, that, kind of encouraging their clients to write things in a certain way. But essentially what happens is, soldiers have to file as you mentioned, an enormous amount of paperwork. And in that paperwork, they have sort of an initial, sorry, getting a phone call, hanging up. They have an initial application that they go through. And in that, they have to, describe what their wound is, or why they're applying for a pension, right? And in that narrative, in that section where they describe that, they almost to a man tell a very particular story, where at the beginning of the war, when they enlisted, they were healthy and strong and willing to fight. And then they were wounded, or they became sick in whatever way it was. And then after that, they were just utterly broken, right? There was no, they weren't able to work. They weren't able to care for themselves. They were really dependent on other people. And that wasn't necessarily an accurate reflection of their real lives.
Right.
But it was what the Pension Bureau needed to hear. They needed to hear that these men had enlisted voluntarily. There's a lot of prejudice against people who are, take bounties or,
Sure.
otherwise kind of, pushed into the service, drafted, certainly.
Yeah.
They want to know that you enlisted willingly, that you were a good soldier, that you were in excellent health, you didn't have any pre-existing problems. And then after your ailment, you were utterly dependent on others.
Right.
And this was,
you were a person of good character, right?
Yes.
That's
Sure.
a huge part with, while you fought, you were brave, you were noble, you were.
There's never any implication that you shirked or that you tried to desert, or that you just had a bad reputation, or you got in trouble, that sort of thing. And then even in the section where they were talking about their modern life, their contemporary life, as they were writing the applications, they had to testify that they didn't drink, that they were good family men, that they didn't have vices. And so they're, as you said, performing this particular vision of what it meant to be a wounded warrior, what it meant to be a wounded true soldier of Union.
Right.
And like I mentioned, that's not necessarily an accurate reflection of their day-to-day lives, because pensions, however, helpful they were and necessary for a lot of soldiers, didn't go that far. I mean, they wouldn't allow you to just be, live on the government dime forever, right? And so a lot of these soldiers in real life are adapting and working in various different ways, but God forbid the Pension Bureau find out that you're working, right? In some cases, they actually do have pension inspectors that will follow people and have them tailed and see whether. There's one story about the inspector following somebody home and seeing him like throw down his crutches and like walk into his house all jaunty, right? And like immediately that guy's pension is revoked.
Right.
And those stories are, I think, few and far between. There's not a ton of them, but it still indicates, how important that image, that perfect sort of disabled person was. And so if there was any indication that you didn't actually fit that mold, your pension could be rejected, or you could be pensioned at a much lower rate. And so it wasn't sufficient for the soldier himself to just testify to his experience of his own body, because that's not trustworthy, right? Like soldiers, the Pension Bureau believed that soldiers were sort of too invested in their own sort of experience to be trustworthy. And so they have to have affidavits filed by neighbors or friends or comrades that fall into the same sort of pattern, right? He was super healthy, and then he went to the war and he came back and he was sick. Of course, if they're going to pass that pension along to a widow or a child, in the event that they pass away, they have to have marriage documents in there, which becomes a huge problem for Black soldiers who often didn't have legalized marriages because they had been enslaved or otherwise disenfranchised. They had to go through multiple medical examinations with surgeons that were approved by the Pension Bureau. And that's where often their descriptions of their own symptoms would be contradicted by a surgeon who would say, well, he doesn't look that bad to me. And that's where what you mentioned before comes into play, right? When someone says, 5 out of 7 days I can function, but those other 2 days I can't get out of bed, I can't take care of myself, I'm in so much pain. If you happen to see the doctor on a day that you're feeling okay for whatever reason, that's gonna work against you in terms of getting your pension.
Yeah.
And so, then these files are huge.
Yeah, they're massive. And not to mention the fact that this is an enormous invasion of privacy for soldiers, of having to constantly be examined and prodded, and have some wounds like Chamberlain, who we can get into, on display for
Yeah.
for everyone to know, maybe wounds that or disabilities that you might not want everyone to know about because they're private or they're in a more intimate place. But you have to put them on display. And of course, one of the other things your book does is talk about how there is a public fascination, a gawking at men who are
Yeah.
disabled. Of course, that the amputees and the prosthetics users were top of that list. But once people knew that you had a disability, there was that fascination.
Yeah.
Not to mention the images that could be put on display in the Army Medical Museum.
Right.
For medical study. So your body becomes not your own anymore. It's
Yeah.
being studied by professionals. It's being put under the scrutiny of bureaucrats, of surgeons, anyone else, newspapers. In the case of Chamberlain, once word gets out, the nature of your wound and your disability. So let's actually delve into Chamberlain a bit here, because he is the quintessential lion of the Union, as you call him, the brave warrior. He has this very eloquent way of speaking and writing. He's wounded 6 times during the war, and every time he goes back into the fighting after the war, he continues to write and lecture and talk about his experiences. He doesn't complain. But privately, there's a different story in there due to that grievous wound that he receives at Petersburg. So let's delve into that a little bit about Chamberlain's story of what exactly happens to him, if you could explain that for us.
Sure.
And then unpack how he represents kind of the quintessential contradiction of the wounded warrior who is trying so hard to still maintain productivity and a public facing image in the wake of the war.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I didn't set out to become like a Chamberlain scholar. Especially because when I was in Gettysburg, in the Gettysburg semester, like, man, that was the kiss of death. You were a real farb if you were too into
Right.
Chamberlain. You were like a Chamberlain fangirl. And I think it's hysterical that I've just leaned fully into that now.
Right.
So Chamberlain it really is to me such a fascinating character. As probably anyone watching this already knows, he's a college professor at the beginning of the war, absolutely no military experience. He, as you said, writes beautifully. His wartime letters back to his family are just full of the most fascinating sort of insights into what it's like to be a soldier, what it's like to be an officer and care for your soldiers. Even down to sort of the musing about kind of the landscape around Gettysburg and thinking sort of in really deep ways about what this all means and what it's for, especially even after the war. He spends a lot of time in public writing and in private writing, kind of musing on what this was all about and what it means on an individual level and on a national level. And so he just provides a lot of material that's really interesting. And so how I came to study Chamberlain is that I was, as I mentioned at the beginning, interested in those other soldiers who were disabled, but who weren't amputees. Mm-hmm. Because I was just noticing that there didn't seem to be much written about them. Everything seemed to focus on amputees. And I couldn't quite figure out how I was going to get at that, right? How I was going to study that. And so I really, on a whim, thought, I seem to recall when I was in Gettysburg, learning something about Chamberlain being wounded. And that was really all that I knew. I didn't know much more than that. And so I started reading biographies of him. Alice Rains Truelock's, really excellent biography called In the Hands of Providence became sort of like my Bible. I was, really pouring through that and pouring through her footnotes, trying to figure out whether there was more to the story of his wound. And you can see little glimpses of it where biographers would say, that the wound still bothered him, or he had underwent another surgery. And I'm thinking, there's another story kind of underlying all of this, right, that we think we know about Chamberlain that isn't being explicitly told, right? It's not rising to the surface. And so I went to Maine and did some research in Alice Rains Truelock's papers and in Chamberlain's papers, and found that, he wrote about the wound constantly. And so to backtrack here. So what happens is, as you mentioned, Chamberlain is at the Battle of Petersburg, and he is leading an attack on June 14th, 15th,
I'm sorry,
18th, something like that, somewhere in the teens. Maybe it's the 18th, against a Confederate fortification called Reeves Salient. And this is part of the attempt to capture the city of Petersburg. This is in 1864. And as he's leading his men across this sort of marshy land, they get to an area that is going to be hard to cross because it's sort of wet. And so he tries to motion to his soldiers, sort of in the heat of this attack, to go around this area where they're going to get bogged down. And so he's got the flag of the Fifth Corps in one hand and his saber in the other, and he's motioning to them like this. And while he's doing that, he's shot in the hip. Every time I tell this story, I second guess myself whether it was the left hip to the right or the right hip to the left. Either way, the same damage, right? But he's hit in the hip, and a mini ball smashes through his hip bone, crosses through his body, in the process cutting through his urethra and just wreaking massive internal damage, and then becoming lodged in his opposite hip. He falls. He talks about trying to stay standing until his men passed him so they wouldn't see him fall. He kind of braces himself, but eventually through blood loss, obviously, and pain, he just collapses on the battlefield. And when he is removed back to the division hospital, they are pretty sure that he's a goner, right. As was, fairly common. If you were hit in the midsection, in the trunk, there was just sort of an understanding that there was very little that could be done for you, especially not in the field. Like, they couldn't really perform the kind of advanced surgery that even off the field isn't super commonplace, right? And so he after they literally poke around trying to get the bullet out, they at one point try using a ramrod to push the mini ball out. Eventually he says, listen, I'm paraphrasing, of course, listen, we all know what's going on here. I am not surviving this. Just set me aside, please, and take care of these other soldiers who are here. So the doctors set him aside. He writes a letter to his wife, which, if you ever have the chance to visit the Bowdoin College Library, it's housed there and it's covered in his blood. I mean, it's just an amazing document. But he doesn't die. He's still alive in the morning. And so the surgeons are like, well, I guess we should do something about this if you're not dying immediately. And so they do some rudimentary surgery. They fit him with a catheter because of the damage to his urethra. And then he's shipped off to Annapolis, where he has the first of many surgeries to try to fix the damage that's been done. The big problem that he faces, though, is that the catheter, and I've read different accounts of what happened, and a lot of it is actually speculation from modern doctors, like urologists, looking back and trying to understand what happened. Either way, the catheter that they used, the friction that it caused, created an unnatural opening at the base of his penis, which is called a fistula. And that fistula was never successfully closed. He underwent several surgeries to try to close it, but it kept reopening. And so this meant that he leaked urine constantly. It also meant that he was constantly at the risk of infection. And so for the rest of his life, he would have periods where he was fairly healthy. and then he would get an infection and he would be very, very sick. And this happens for the rest of his life. And of course, on top of that, he also has the damage that's been done to his hips,
right,
which makes it really difficult for him to walk. It makes it difficult for him to ride. Obviously, this is a wound in the groin. Riding would have been very, very painful. As the wounds heal, he has adherent scar tissue that makes it, even more painful to move. And so it just continues to affect his quality of life until his death.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's what's remarkable about him. I think probably most people who know anything about him, they might remember either his relatively slight wound at Little Round Top, or oh yeah, he was wounded at Petersburg, but they don't realize that he was so severely wounded because he went back
exactly
to work, as president of the college, and he was lecturing, and he was attending monument dedications, and he comes back to Gettysburg and he helps plan the 50th anniversary of the war at Gettysburg, and he doesn't mention it publicly. He doesn't whine. He tries to hide it, and until, of course, it's revealed. Right? Was it right before his last surgery, or one of his last surgeries, that it's revealed in the newspapers? Yeah,
it's an interesting case because when he is wounded, that would have made news, certainly in Maine anyway. So people knew that he had been wounded.
Sure.
But in 1883, I think it is, his doctors in New York City say, because he often traveled out of Brunswick to larger cities where the elite doctors were. His doctors in New York City basically say, like, you have to stop working, because he kept putting off this surgery. You have to stop working and you have to come get this surgery done now. And as a result of that, he had to sort of resign his position at Bowdoin. And I think maybe the combination of him sort of resigning and going to New York is what caught the attention of journalists, and particularly in Portland, Maine, which is really close to Brunswick. And so they write, I think the New York Times runs an article about his surgery, but I think it's fairly short. And then the Portland, I think it's called the Transcript, the newspaper, runs a really long, sort of detailed account of the surgery in a way that, even though it's euphemistic because it's the 19th century, it's still pretty clear what is going on and what the details of this surgery are, in a way that, I don't have a letter from Chamberlain saying what that must have been like to know that everybody was kind of party to what was happening, what his wound was like and what the surgery was like. But I can only imagine, for someone as proud and as intent on managing his self-image as Chamberlain, that must have been mortifying.
Sure. I mean, that's the physical embodiment of emasculation, when you have that particular wound and then these issues and leaking urine. And it's kind of like when you're talking about the men who experience chronic diarrhea, that's not exactly a red badge of courage that you want to flaunt to society. I'm sure, Chamberlain didn't want to tell everybody about his urine leaking, or his marital issues that you also talk about. His marriage is breaking down, maybe as a result of multiple issues. We don't really know, as you say, between the letters that we have. But certainly that kind of wound and the impact on the body would have had a strong impact on his relationship with his wife. And he and Fanny had been, such an intimate couple beforehand that it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't have had that image or that impact.
Absolutely.
And so he files for a pension eventually, right? And he doesn't work, and he can't work anymore at the order of his surgeons. So he's racking up medical bills. Fanny is she's going blind, or
Fanny's going blind. Yep.
He has a dependent son who has difficulty finding work, right?
Yep. Willis.
And he can't seem to find work anywhere that can accommodate his bodily needs. So he literally needs the money. But that process, tell us about the process of the issues he runs into.
Right. So he initially files for his pension in 1872. And so he was pensioned at a fairly, reasonable, typical rate. It wasn't particularly high, wasn't particularly, super, super low either. But once he has to sort of resign from Bowdoin to get that last surgery in 1883, he really is in a dire financial straits, right? And there, again, there is a little bit of like disagreement among scholars about, was he, was it just that he was cash poor, because we know that he owned some properties, what was the extent of it? Either way, he wasn't working, he needed support, he had family members that depended on him, he needed the money, or he needed a job. And he wasn't able to work consistently. And so in the early 1890s, he applies for a pension increase, which was really common. Lots of people did this. And they often did it because their wound was getting worse, right? The after effects, the lingering effects were accumulating. And so Chamberlain tries to apply for an increase, which means automatically he has to go in for these examinations. And he, in his own paperwork, is fairly honest. And he says, I'm okay most of the time. I mean, again, paraphrasing, I'm able to function most of the time, but then I have these intermittent infections that make it impossible for me to work at all for long stretches. And so the Pension Bureau sets up an appointment for him to be examined in Maine, near where he lived. But then he is, I want to say that he had traveled to New York City for some reason. And while he was there, he got another, he came down with another terrible infection. In this case, it was so severe that he almost died. There's a really powerful letter that I didn't quote in the chapter, but where he's explaining what happened to a family member, and he essentially passes out. Like he wasn't feeling particularly well. He ended up at someone's house, his daughter's house or someone's house, and was trying to leave, trying to get ready to go back to Brunswick or something, and he passes out and ends up stranded there because he's so sick that he can't travel. So he was very, very ill, and he misses his examination, which I think is so ironic, right? He was like, he was too sick to get to the examination. So the examination is rescheduled. He goes and gets it, and the doctor that he sees is sort of like, yeah, I mean, he's going gray. He's getting older, but he seems to be perfectly fine to me. Like he's, there's no sign of general debility, is what the examiner says. And what they mean by that is that he's not utterly dependent, right? He's not so broken down that he can't function. And indeed, like, he could walk, he could write, he could, lead a fairly typical life, other than the day-to-day pain of those wounds, right? The damage to his body, the mobility impairment that it caused, and then these terrible infections, right? And the doctor, runs down in his description, like, his penis does not function at all. This fistula is still open. All of these different things that he's still dealing with, sort of chronic infections. And he still says, but, since he seems like he's able to get around, and he's still traveling and still writing and trying different business ventures, he's just not disabled enough.
Yeah. Just
not disabled enough. And so they decline his attempt to get that pension raised. Yeah. So, as some people might know, Chamberlain's brother Tom was a pension attorney, and so the board writes to Tom and says, we're declining this. We're not going to give him this increase. And Tom, tries to get appeal it basically. And Chamberlain says, no, that I'm done. Like, I'm not going through this process again. And so eventually he does get a patronage position working as a surveyor of the port in Portland. So he's able to get enough money that they're okay, but he certainly could have used the extra support from the Pension Bureau. Absolutely.
Sure. And that's not exactly his dream job in terms of maintaining that public facing facade, the reputation that he wants to maintain.
Exactly.
Is not what he had worked for his entire life. And then of course it's another infection of the same wound that ultimately takes his life, right? Yeah. And this is one of the things that we were actually just talking about with some of the students at CWI, is about how many soldiers we don't think of who, we have this number now, 700 to 750,000 men were killed in the Civil War, but how many died because of the war at a later time? And I think that's where the numbers keep rising and rising.
Yeah.
To think of the long Civil War that these guys had in trying to reckon with these wounds and trying to refine their place in society and face the shame or humiliation, frustration, all of that went along with not being able to provide for one's family or maintain that position that in society, that job, that profession that you had before that had brought you so much joy or it elevated you socially. I have a final question before I want to ask you briefly about Nursing Cleo and the podcast.
Sure.
So just kind of a more general question. We know that these disabled soldiers, some of them, of course, there was mental trauma as well, which we haven't really touched on today, but a lot of scholars have worked on that as well. And some of these mentally disabled soldiers being put into asylums, sometimes often much against their will, again, the loss of control of their bodies. So maybe with those soldiers excluded, the ones who were disabled physically in society, who were not able to rejoin the amputees, who could come back for monument dedications or participate in GAR reunions or events, how did they view other disabled men who were maybe perhaps more able-bodied than they were, and vice versa? Was there kind of a community of disabled men who kind of saw each other equally or had more sympathy or understanding for the ones whose disabilities weren't as recognized? Or was there a hierarchy within the disabled community that kind of separated some men, like the red badge of courage type men, the amputees, from those who had the chronic diarrhea, for instance? Do you know much about that dynamic?
Yeah, that is such a great question. There is, to a certain extent, a sort of shared sympathy of experience that disabled soldiers have. And where I saw that the most was in like some of Chamberlain's letters, for instance. He got a lot of, especially because he was the governor for a period, governor of Maine. He got a lot of letters from soldiers either that had served under him or that just lived in Maine and knew that he was a sort of high-ranking general, asking him for help and saying, telling him similar stories that he had experienced, like, I'm not getting enough from my pension, things are really rough right now, that sort of thing, and asking for his help. And I know that at least in some cases, he wrote on their behalf to the Pension Bureau, he offered affidavits, things like that. And so I know that there is an attempt to help each other in that way. But, there isn't, after the war, a kind of movement that we might think of as like as like disability activism, right? There isn't an attempt to band together as a group of that identify as disabled in the way that we'll see after World War II and after Vietnam, where like veterans groups actually sort of end up joining with civilian disabled activist groups and working to create like the disability rights movement at the end of the 20th century, for instance. That doesn't happen after the Civil War. And I think it does indicate that disability was understood as individual. It wasn't understood as something that was culturally informed. Does that make sense? Like, I think that it was very much understood that this is your problem. It's your individual medical problem. And there isn't sort of a larger thing going on where soldiers are trying to group together based on that shared experience.
Yeah.
So and then there are also, like, even within the Veteran Reserve Corps, for instance, there is a hierarchy sort of battle wounds over soldiers who are disabled because of sickness, right? And so that individuality certainly carries with it different cultural meanings depending on how soldiers are wounded. I think that was more something that the general public thought more about than soldiers. But, you know, I'm basing that just kind of on my own hunch from reading these, you know, their papers and pensions and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And the reason I wondered that was we had talked with Jonathan Jones last year, I think it was last spring, about the veterans who became addicted to opium to deal with their mental trauma or the physical pain of their battle wounds or disease. And we had asked a similar question, and he kind of had a similar answer, that there was a general understanding and sympathy and empathy that they had all gone through these things together. Sometimes maybe some questions were asked, like, why couldn't you do a better job of recovering than I did? But there wasn't, you know, a collective, you know, upholding of these guys. It was kind of, these are the people who have this addiction for these reasons, and these are these other people, you know, who are disabled or have been wounded or suffered. But that lack of activism and coming together, that kind of collective identity or consciousness, that's interesting to me that didn't emerge right after the war, despite the huge numbers of
And what is, I think, also interesting is that there wasn't any attempt to integrate disabled veterans with other categories of disabled people, right? There wasn't an understanding that there's a disabled population, but rather, you know, veterans were sort of their own thing. And you see that a little bit after other wars, like World War I, for instance. There's a lot of, you know, attention paid to disabled World War II veterans. And at that time, you know, there are disabled civilians who kind of say, well, wait a second, if we're going to do this for veterans, why can't we do this for all disabled Americans? And eventually they kind of integrate those two groups and create these larger disability activism groups. And that doesn't happen after the Civil War. And I think it's because veterans really kind of understood themselves as being different. In ways that were tied to their military service and to their masculinity, and, you know, really saw civilian disabled people as the bad ones, as the paupers, as the people who just couldn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is weird considering that so many veterans were themselves testifying that they needed support. But they weren't able to kind of apply that to other people.
They still saw themselves as somehow distinct. Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Sarah, this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And honestly, one of the things that I like so much about your book is that it does so much in such a short number of pages. You don't have to read an 800-page tome. Not that there's anything wrong with those books that are huge. But this is a very accessible book. Obviously, it delves into these cultural ideas, which might seem a little overwhelming at first to some people, but it is accessible, and it does so much in just a short number of pages. So you can really dig deeply into these more complex issues without being laden down in pages upon pages of anecdotes, which is really helpful, I think, to most people. Before I let you go, can you just tell us a little bit more about these two other projects that you work on, which are a little bit more public facing? So the Nursing Cleo blog, as well as your podcast called Dig.
Sure. So Nursing Cleo was born in, I believe, 2012 by my friend Jackie Antonovich. And it started out actually as like a public history seminar project that sort of took on a life of its own. And what it is it's a public facing digital, we change the way we define it all the time, how we try to describe it. It's a public facing digital blog, right? Publishing outlet, digital magazine, whatever you want to call it, right. That publishes short essays on topics that are sort of at the intersection of gender, health, and culture. Mm-hmm. So it started, sort of maybe a little bit more focused on the history of medicine, but it's evolved over time to sort of, encompass anything that sort of falls within those larger themes. Mm-hmm. And so we've published a wide variety of stuff. I mean, tons and tons of stuff. I wish I had a number of exactly how many essays we've published by now, but it's a lot. I don't know how many, but it's a lot.
And it's from every historical time period too.
Yes.
It's not just limited to Civil War and 19th century. It's the full.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. And we're actively trying to expand the essays that we publish on, areas of specialization outside of America and Great Britain and places where we tend to, there tends to be more content on that. So we're always trying to solicit more essays on, African health and Asian health and things like that, and gender roles. And so I started writing for Nursing Cleo in 2013, I think. I came on as a editor a couple of years after that. And then just this past year, Jackie stepped down as the executive editor and I took over as executive editor. So it's just an absolute privilege to be trusted with, her baby and to try to keep it going. And I think so far we've been doing okay.
Well, what a time period too to solicit articles about health and medicine and gender and all of that. It's unfortunate what's going on right now, but it's also, I guess, maybe beneficial for scholarship.
It's been an interesting time because there is just it's been a good demonstration of just how much there is to learn about our current experience based on the past, but also a space for people to write about, almost processing their experiences as teachers and as scholars of medicine, living through this moment, or scholars of gender who are, quarantined at home with their kids, trying to maintain professional lives. Oh, cameo from my dog. This is Jed. He's a greyhound.
I love greyhounds. I used to have one growing up.
Yeah. And so it has been a really interesting year for the blog for a number of reasons. We're growing and transitioning and people are moving around in their roles. But we have a great group of editors and writers, and it's an absolute labor of love. None of us are paid in any capacity to run this thing. And the amount of work that our staff, our team puts in is phenomenal. And I think that we do good work.
The contributors, they're from a wide variety of fields and backgrounds as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've published essays by undergraduates, by tenured scholars, by doctors, scientists, middle school teachers, people working in public history. I mean, we publish a wide variety of stuff.
That makes for such a rich interdisciplinary set of readings for people too. And it seems like there could be something for everyone in that kind of a setting where people are contributing from all backgrounds.
Definitely. And we have some Civil War content as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what about Dig? What podcast?
So Dig initially started in 2015. We started it as we were going to do a local history podcast, focused on sort of things that were, connected somehow to Buffalo. This was when I was in graduate school, and all of my graduate school colleagues were interested in doing something in an audio form. And so we just kind of dove in without knowing anything about audio or podcasting or anything. And so it was kind of an experiment for the first maybe 18 months to 2 years, trying to decide what worked and what we liked. And so we did a ton of different kinds of episodes. We did interview episodes, and then we did, episodes that were really more like journalistic audio stories that you might hear on something like NPR. Not anywhere near as good as that, but we tried. And then finally, we sort of realized that what we liked was using the audio format as a way to take really complicated, important, scholarly conversations about a certain subject and transforming them into something that's accessible to a public audience. Because we found that there's a lot of appetite, as I'm sure viewers of the series, can attest to. There is a lot of interest in good, nuanced history out there. People want that. It's just sometimes hard to find.
Right.
And so we rebranded the podcast in 2016 or 2017 as Dig, where we do sort of narrative form, roughly an hour long. If it's an episode that like my colleague Marissa put together, then it's more like an hour and a half. But we try to keep them around an hour. And we release 4 episodes at a time. We call those series. And they're roughly 6 weeks apart. That gives us time to research, write, record, edit, all of that stuff. And we do episodes on everything, you name it. I myself have done episodes on everything from the history of suits to the, radical religion of the ghost dance and the massacre of Wounded Knee. I just did an episode about the supernatural imaginary of the Nazi party and their occult beliefs. I mean, it's all over the place, and it's so fun to be able to kind of get out of my own research subjects and to kind of dabble in other people's specializations.
Sure. And both of these things are free and open, accessible to the public, right? So if people even did a Google search for Nursing Cleo or for Dig, they would be able to find it.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And as I said,
it was wonderful.
Yes, no, this has been great. And obviously, people who are the Gettysburg aficionados, you got your dose of Chamberlain today. And
yes,
Sarah said it's okay. It's okay.
Yes, it's okay to be a Chamberlain fangirl.
Yes, exactly. And again, just a really, really fascinating and very accessible, again, I can't stress that enough, accessible study of disability during the Civil War and after the war in the North. A great read, and obviously please check out any of Sarah's other projects with the podcast Dig and with Nursing Cleo, which I've been on there several times looking through different articles. It does have literally something for everyone, a wide variety of articles, which is really a testament to your hard work and the hard work of your co-editors over the years, but also the fact that you make public facing programming priority, which is huge, I think, as scholars. Yeah. So thank you for all you do, both today and for the public history community, and of course for the scholarly community as well. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This was, of course, you can probably tell we're not in the dark. This was a pre-recorded program, so we actually filmed this morning due to our schedules just working out that way. But please feel free to leave any questions or comments you would like to on the Facebook page. And hopefully that will result in some discussion amongst other viewers as well. So our next Finding the Source is actually going to be just in a couple of weeks. we are going to be featuring CWI's own Dr. Jill Ogline-Titus, who just released her new book. It's actually coming out in just a couple of weeks. It was a little bit delayed. Gettysburg 1963, on the centennial commemorations of Gettysburg, Cold War era, Civil War rights era monumentation, and how those kind of blended with the 100th anniversary of the war and commemorations in Gettysburg. So that will be November 10th, live streamed a Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. And we hope to see you then. Thank you.